Hi everyone, welcome back to the Clean Architecture with BLoC in Flutter series. In the last episode, we talked about models and entities, how models parse raw JSON and entities keep our domain layer clean. Today, we're moving one step forward, the repository pattern. Repository pattern is a design pattern. So what's a design pattern? A design pattern is a reusable solution to a common software problem. It's not code you copy paste. It's a template for how to solve a problem in a clean and consistent way. In our case, the repository pattern solves this problem. How do I get data without my business logic caring where it comes from? So why we should use repository pattern? Okay, so let's start simple. Imagine we're building our news app. Right now, we have a data source that fetches news from the API, but here's the problem. Our UI or domain layer doesn't care about how we get the news. It just wants the news. This is where the repository comes in. The repository acts like a middleman. It hides all the details about whether data comes from the network, a database, or even cache. It just provides clean data to the domain layer or presentation layer. So the repository make our code flexible. If tomorrow we want to switch from Genius API to another API or add caching, our presentation or domain won't even notice. That's the power of the repository pattern. Alright, let's jump back into the code. We're still in the domain layer inside our news feature. Now I want to add a Dart file to repositories folder. I name it newsrepository.dart. In Dart, we don't have interface keywords like in some other languages, such as Java. Instead, we use an abstract class to achieve the same result. Abstract classes in Dart can't be directly instantiated. They just define a contract, like a blueprint, that other classes must follow. That's exactly what we want for a repository. So here I add our abstract class called news repository. Right now it's empty, but the idea is that any repository in data layer that provides news data will have to implement this contract. Before I continue with the repository, I want one tiny building block that makes error handling super clean across the app. Inside core, I'll create a folder called resources and a file named DataState. This file will define a generic wrapper that represents either a success with data or a failure with an error message. That way, my repository and use cases don't throw exceptions around. They just return one predictable type. I'm defining an abstract generic class called DataState, a wrapper that will hold either data or an error. The T lets it hold any data type. This is the data field. It's final, so it can't change it after creation. And nullable, because when there's an error, we won't have data. And this is our error field, a nullable string that will hold an error message when something goes wrong. Now I add a const constructor that takes both data and error. Subclasses will call this with either a real data value or an error string. Okay, next I create data success class. It's a subclass that represents a success result. It still uses the same generic T. The constructor accepts the data and calls the parent with the data and null for the error. That's how we signal success. Now I want to add our data failed, the failure variant. It can use the same generic type, but we won't provide any data here. This constructor accepts an error message and passes null for data. This tells the rest of the app this operation failed. Okay, now let's come back to our repository to use these classes. Okay, now I'm going to add a method called getNews. Notice the return type. This method will either give us a news response entity wrapped in data success, or an error wrapped in data field. Now where we should implement the body of this method. Let's jump to the data layer. Inside repositories, I'll create a file called news repository implementation. This is the actual implementation of our abstract repository. So we define our methods inside domain layer, but we implement them inside our data layer. Let's extend from news repository, and now we should implement the news repository methods. Here I am creating a final field to hold our news API client instance. This is the object we use to fetch news from the API. And in the constructor, we accept this object and assign it to the field. This way, anywhere inside the repository, we can access the API client. Now let's implement our methods body. I'm starting a try block to handle potential errors when fetching data from the API. Here I call the getNews method from our API client and wait for the response. This is the actual network request. If response status code equals to 200, means the request was successful. Now we should return a data success. Let's use our from JSON from news response model to convert the raw JSON into an object. Here's an important detail. Notice I'm creating a news response entity, but the object that actually does the parsing is a news response model. Why? Because models live in the data layer. They know how to deal with JSON, APIs, and databases. But entities live in the domain layer. They're pure business objects that our UI and logic use. So the model does the dirty work of from JSON, then hands over a clean entity for the rest of the app. This keeps our domain layer independent of JSON or API details. Now we can put our entity object inside data success. If the status code is not 200, we can handle it here. For now, I just returned a data field with a simple error message. You could customize this for different codes. And if any exception occurs during the request, like network error, it's caught here. You can handle it in any way you want. For now, we just return a data field containing the exception message as a string so the UI can show an error. And that's it. Today we got familiar with the repository pattern. That's it for now. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next one.